what the parenting challenges are and what went wrong. So we talked about how uh, some of the protective factors of our family, such as the extended family, the shared value system of the community, um, has been eroded over the last few decades, as well as the risk factors have increased. Risk factors such as the disintegration of the family unit, the increase. I mean, we talked about how media and technology has played a great part in this, in parenting challenges. And we also talked about how the what the challenges of parenting are, what the things we're dealing with, such as the rise in youth crime and peer violence, in sexual promiscuity, in the rise of substance abuse, and other challenges such as those, and how these are different from the challenges that our parents faced or the teachers in the public school system faced in previous generations. And we talked a little bit about the role of peers. We will talk a little bit about that. Today we will continue with that. But we spent some time on the role of the media and how, especially in this age of mobile technology, the value system of the children is often compromised, and they get a lot of destructive messages from the media. So I'm wondering if, I know there were a couple of questions on email, but I'm wondering if there were any questions about anything we discussed last week before we move on to our topic for today. So, inshallah, today we will be talking about what the parenting role is in this crisis of conscience. And when we're talking about the crisis of conscience, we're basically talking about the moral challenges that the youth are facing today, such as the rise in substance abuse, the rise in stealing, in cheating in schools, in all the things that are compromising the moral values and akhlaq of our children. So today we will be looking at what we can do as parents, or what our role has been in this in this crisis. But before we begin, I know we just mentioned briefly about the role of peers, and we did say that peers are not as important as sometimes parents believe they are. So I thought it might be actually maybe useful to elaborate on that a little bit. So we said that peers influence things like dress choices, entertainment, the language children use, and parents are much more influential in things like religion, in education, and in the core values of children. So also what research shows is that, and this was specifically about teens, because as we know, peer influence tends to be highest in the early teen years, which is, say, for example, between 12 to 14 or so is the peak time for peer influence. But what research shows is that teens rarely force other teens, or they rarely bully other teens into trying risky behavior. However, on the flip side of it, children tend to hang around with people of um, similar inclinations. So friends' influence is much more subtle. It's not as obvious as children bullying other children into doing things which they don't believe in. However, of course, it is a valid concern. It's not that it's not there, but parents should take hope that their influence and the value system that has been laid out in childhood is very important, and actually it does prevent children from falling into peer influence. So, how do we as parents minimize a negative influence that parents that other children may have? And some of the action points are that we should be okay with being the bad guy. In other words, children sometimes need um, to, when they are being influenced or pressured by peers, they need somebody to blame, unquote, quote unquote. Um, for example, if they're not allowed to stay out late, it's much more cool, for example, to say, you know what, my parents are just too strict, they don't understand me, and I would love to stay out, but I can't. So they do sometimes need that fallback position. How you can minimize friends' influence on your children is obviously to build your own relationship with your teenager, with your preteen. Talk to them about even about really difficult subjects and be an askable parent. To be an askable parent simply means to be a parent which is open to being questioned and having a discussion about really difficult issues. And even in these parenting series, we do talk about some pretty either controversial or difficult subjects, because what research shows is that if you talk about these things at home, your children are much less likely to try risky behavior than if these subjects are taboo at home. So, for example, I mean, reality is in the West, especially in a place like Canada, that our children are extremely exposed to the concept of homosexuality. It is actually talked about in schools. It is not encouraged, but the idea of accepting that lifestyle is greatly encouraged, and our children are actually exposed to this kind of thinking from a very young age. And whether we like to believe it or not, they are greatly influenced by it. So, unless and until we are willing to talk about these things in our homes with our children, again, the idea is that they will only be exposed to the value system which we may not agree with, and they are not getting the benefit of the other side of it or our value system. It's so when we talk about being an askable parent, that is what we're talking about. Being the parent who is willing to talk about things that make us extremely uncomfortable, that we're not prepared to deal with it. But what research shows is that it's much more useful to be willing to talk about the things than rather than to doing it what we consider right, quote unquote. So just a willingness to be a sounding board for our kids or willing to talk to them about these subjects is known to be a great protective factor. Give them the facts. So what research shows is that many children greatly overestimate the the behavior of other teens. For example, they overestimate how many people are drinking, how many people are taking drugs, how many people are engaging in promiscuous behavior. Um, if a child, for example, thinks everyone is doing it, obviously they would feel a greater pressure to also, engage in whatever risky behavior. However, if we actually do a little bit of homework on our end and, arm ourselves with the facts that, what, not everyone is doing it. Children who are successful, who are well adjusted in school, who are doing well at school, are not the ones who may be abusing substances or engaging in other risky behavior. Following through with consequences. So again, the idea that if we have set limits at home, we should be willing to follow through with the consequences of those limits. For example, if a child misses a curfew, and we basically need to care enough about them um, to make sure that they really experience the downside of having broken a limit. Wait up for them. So again, when teens are going out on their own and they may be coming home at a time which we at a later time than the family is awake, for example, what research shows is that if parents are staying awake for children and children actually have to encounter the parents before they go to bed themselves, they are much less likely to engage in risky behavior. Encouraging speaking up. So, the idea of children should be seen and not heard, just obey without discussion may not be such a good strategy when the child is dealing with peer influence. So if a child has been encouraged to speak up for what is right and to speak their mind, to voice their opinions, again, obviously this is a double-edged sword, but basically what research shows is that this kind of behavior will keep them in good stead when they're dealing with peer influence. And lastly, to do preventative teaching and role plays. What this means is obviously if we are aware of what's there in the society, and obviously a lot of our work in these sessions has been to educate ourselves about what we're dealing with, what is out there. Once we know what's out there, it is easier for us to actually prevent that or preempt that by engaging in that discussion before our child experiences it. One of a great example of that would be, for example, substance abuse. Many of us may know that marijuana use, for example, is a very prevalent thing starting from about age 11 up for most children. That's when their peers are definitely in their school, whether your child goes to an Islamic school or not. I'm sorry to tell you, they will be encountering this in their school. So again, if we already know that, we need to start having conversations with them about these things before they will actually be offered their first joint, for example. It's a good idea to also do role plays. So, for example, what would you do if? What would you do if somebody offered you, or somebody said, let's go out at lunchtime, and my parents won't be home. When the child has engaged in role plays, when they've actually practiced what they're going to say, it's much more likely that even if they don't come up with the exact same things, they are more likely to be able to restrain themselves from engaging in that risky behavior. And so our next topic is talking about how our parenting practices are contributing to this crisis. And so basically the three things we're going to be talking about are the parenting practices of modern parents and what is their impact on the children. We will also discuss briefly what makes our children successful and happy. And given that the course is about the challenge of materialism, and we've talked in many different sessions about the importance of modeling, how that is the number one thing that children take away from the parenting relationship is how the parents are living their own life. We will talk today as well, inshallah, about an examination of our own level of materialism. So let's see what are the different types of parenting practices. In other words, what we're talking about here is that all of us have a different style of parenting. Some of us are more lenient, some of us are stricter, and it's again, the whole idea is to be a little bit intentional about what we do so that we get closer to our goals rather than move away from them. And obviously, if we understand, what we're doing and what the impact is on our children, we're much more likely to make um, those intentional decisions. So the first, and again, the idea is that um, none of these, although we've put impacts on children, obviously everything is on a continuum. Some of us are, um, we may share traits of many different things, and even if we parent a certain way, it does not mean that the impact on children is going to be exactly that. For the simple reason that obviously children are influenced by many different things, not just our general parenting style. So, but just for the purposes of discussion, obviously, and what research has shown is the general impact on children if we parent in certain ways. So, neglectful parenting simply means that the parent is neither too demanding of the child nor too responsive of the child's needs. And the parent would have very low involvement in the children's life, and they would set very few limits. And although we think, that it would be, we most of us cannot imagine parenting in this way. But for example, if a family is going through a major crisis, or if there is parental depression, if there is domestic violence, for many different reasons, there can be times in a child's life or an extended period in a child's life where the parents are not as uh, able or capable of giving attention to the children. And obviously, as one can imagine, the impact of children of neglectful parenting can be pretty severe. They can be emotionally withdrawn. They show patterns of truancy and delinquency. This means truancy simply means cutting school or running away, and delinquency means getting in trouble with the law, breaking limits. They also tend to lack self-control, have low self-esteem, and are less competent than their peers. Authoritarian parenting is the type of parenting which gives a lot of attention to the child, but in a way that demands a lot from them in terms of obedience, in terms of responsibility, and they are low in responsiveness to the parents, to the child's developmental needs or the child's emotional needs. So parents who are authoritarian also tend to rely heavily on the use of coercion to force the child's compliance. In other words, they would use punishment, sometimes physical punishment, which, as we know, is not only against the law, but it is highly discouraged in Islam. And this is the kind of parenting that a lot of our generation of parents experience from their parents, right? The idea that child was supposed to be seen, not heard, and the idea that children were simply meant to obey. The outcome is that the children are obedient, they're proficient, but they can be anxious, withdrawn, and unhappy. They also, if we use physical punishment on children, they may often display aggression and hostility with peers or with people who are younger than themselves, and they may develop second identities. What I mean by that is that often if the parents are too strict without having the emotional connection with the children, if that's when we see what is sometimes called the generation gap, or if the home environment is too strict, we may see that the child may behave completely differently outside the home than inside the home. And I think a very big uh, example of this was the famous Aksa Parvez case, which happened a few years ago in Toronto, where the young girl actually ended up getting killed because she had a second identity outside the home, and the father found out and got violent. On the other spectrum is what is known as permissive parenting. It's also called laissez-faire parenting in some articles. And this is a kind of parenting which is very high in responsiveness. In other words, they want to make the child happy, and they're very low demanding of the child in terms of setting limits or of being responsible. And the parents who engage in this kind of parenting want to be friends rather than parents, and they have very few or no limits. The outcome of this kind of parenting is that children tend to be immature. They may be self-centered, impulsive. Contrary to what the parents, I mean, most parents who are very too lenient think that this is going to make the child happy. This kind of parenting may also result in what we call junk praise, in heaping a lot of praise on the child, and that actually shows that the children rank lower in self-esteem and in self-regulation. In other words, in self-control, and they may have also problems with authority. This is a very apt hadith from Imam Muhammad Baqir alayhi salam, and it says, "The worst of parents are those who transgress the limits in their love and goodness to their children." In other words, again, being very permissive parents is not something which is being encouraged in Islam. Helicopter parenting is a relatively new phenomena, and I think probably the reason is that parents tend to also have more time and more material resources than they did. So helicopter parents are over-involved in their children's lives. They make sure that their children's needs are met, are honored wherever they go. They must have their foods, their routines must remain unchanged. I think all of us see examples of this. These are parents who will continue to do their children's homework, for example, even though the children are capable of doing it. They will be over involved in the children's school environment as well. And when I say over involved, I'm talking about if the child does not get a grade that the parent thinks they deserve, they may go and speak to the authorities. And this is actually, helicopter parenting is a very real and a very disturbing phenomena of modern parenting. I think, there was a recent book on the Tiger Mom, which got a lot of press. And that was, I think, the whole idea was, it was somewhere between authoritarian parenting and helicopter parenting, about how involved and aggressive a parent should be in making sure that their children's demands and needs are met. The name of the book was Tiger Mom, and it was quite interesting. So children of helicopter parenting tend to grow up with a sense of entitlement, but they do lack confidence. And the reason for that, again, is that they have not been allowed to make mistakes. The parents have shielded out them too much from the consequences of their own mistakes. And so obviously the children find it very difficult to make decisions for themselves. I think this is, again, helicopter parenting is seen a lot where there is a lot of pressure from the family to succeed in academia. at all costs. And while that, doing well in school is is a really great goal, it's a very valid goal. I think it needs to be balanced with the idea that sometimes the best thing that can happen to a child is to actually get a bad grade. So if the child hasn't worked or for whatever reason is struggling in the short term, um, for them, parents need to be okay with them doing badly for their longer term good. When we are not okay with that, when we're not okay with them making mistakes and learning from those mistakes, is when we tend to get over involved in the children's lives. And I mean, I've had many conversations with parents who find it extremely difficult not to push the children in inappropriate ways and in ways which are really not good for the long term well-being of the child. So I really love this quote. It says, think of your child standing to your right, and the problem that she needs to solve is on your left. If you step between her and the problem, you become the problem. She cannot see around you and she cannot see the solution. So get out of the way. And that is, really good advice for all of us who struggle with being helicopter parents. And again, it's a very difficult thing to judge whether we are over involved, because I think it is become so culturally acceptable to be so involved that it's hard for us to see. But again, when we, really another good quote to live by is, do not do for the child what they can do for themselves. So again, even if the child does badly in a school year, or actually, for example, if they have a teacher, which, I know a lot of parents, when the the teachers are, when they know which teacher has been given to their child, they will go to school and basically advocate for the child to get a different teacher, which is either better or more popular, or for whatever reason they think is more suitable for their child. Now, if you really think of the long-term growth of your child, it is probably much better for them to actually struggle through a semester with a teacher that is not great and learn to make the best of the situation, rather than having the parent uh, make the situation as easy for the child as possible. I mean, these things obviously require a lot of discussion, and these are just basically food for thought. It would be great if we could actually, um, engage in a conversation around these issues. But please feel free to note down your thoughts, or to type them out. So authoritative parenting is the I've listed actually all the characteristics of it because it is the most important, and the a kind of parenting that leads to the best outcomes for children. So in authoritative parenting, parents are the ones who are in charge. They are not, again, we talked, I think, last week about how it used to be a very adult-centered world, and then nowadays it's a very child-centered world, right? But again, in the best situation, it's balanced between the needs of all family members, but parents are definitely in charge of the household. It's not run by the children. On the other hand, they do listen to their children, so there is the emotional bonding, and the children are also a valid uh, member and an important members of the family system. The parents encourage independence in their children, and they encourage personal responsibility. What that means is, again, that if the child makes a mistake, they are invited and encouraged to take the fallout. So, for example, if they do badly in a course, or let's use a very common example, If a child does not finish a piece of homework and the next morning does not want to go to school because they are afraid to face the teacher, it's extremely tempting to either write a note saying that they were unwell or whatever, which would be the untruth. So it's really not setting a great example for children's moral growth, or to let them stay home. But again, in the long run, what is best for the child is actually to take responsibility for that, even though it may be difficult in the short run. It's much better for the child to make amends, or if they get into trouble in school because of what they did, that's really not a bad thing. Um, so authoritative parents also place limits and consequences and expectations on their children's behavior. So again, they have very high expectations of children, and that is not, there is no problem in that as long as those are balanced with the child's development and their inherent capabilities. Um, so also authoritative parents, although they are strict, they do express warmth and nurturance. So the idea, the relationship with the children is good. Children are allowed to express opinions. So although the parents are in charge, it does not mean that the children do not have a voice or they are not able to speak up. So children are also encouraged to discuss options, and authoritative parents administer fair and consistent discipline. So again, it's a good idea to, to look at this list and see, how much we are, if we are meeting the standard, or where is it that we need to do the work. The outcome of authoritative parenting is that children tend to be much more well adjusted in school and in life. They are more likely to be happy and capable and successful. And children tend to do best in homes where there is love and warmth, but also very clear rules and limits, and the parents are in charge. So the three words I think that sum up, authoritative parenting are positive, firm, and consistent. So parenting styles tend to be stable across generations. And what kind of parenting style do you think most of us have? So I know we discussed the ideal, but if we were to be really honest with ourselves, what do you think most of us, what kind of parenting style do you think most people in today's generation have? Okay, so we have all three. We have authoritarian, submissive, and authoritative. And again, the difference between authoritarian is when there is no room for the children's opinions, and when it's my way or the highway. And the authoritative is when parents are in charge, but again, um, there is room for you know for conversation and like a sense of democracy. And it's interesting because I think it also depends on the culture. Those of us who think that most parents are authoritarian would probably be exposed to, sometimes what happens is immigrant parents tend to become authoritarian because they fear losing their cultural roots, and because children tend to assimilate much quicker in an environment than parents do, they tend to really lay down the law kind of thing. Um, so let's see what research shows about our parenting practices. We're going to be talking now about the this really large-scale study, which is called the Parenting Practices in the Millennium, or PPM for short, study. And what it was undertaken by, or it was talked about by this person by the name of Dan Kindlin, who said that the reason why they did the study was because most social research tended to focus on why children from disadvantaged backgrounds tended to have problems in terms of social, emotional, psychological problems. But he said that what he found as a therapist in a very affluent class of society was that the children of affluent parents also had an extremely high rate of emotional and psychological problems. So what he decided was that he really needed to find out what was causing this. What was it, because it made sense that children from disadvantaged backgrounds who, for example, dealt with things like poverty, who dealt with single, being brought up by single parents, who had multiple partners, who, they may have three children from three different parents. He said it made sense that those people would have it, but what he couldn't understand was why children from good homes, quote unquote, were, also encountering problems. So they did this study, and they had a few quite interesting findings. And what he found was that it was parenting practices at the turn of the century which were causing a lot of the trouble in the younger generation. And the first finding was that our generation of parents are giving too much and expecting too little. So again, giving too much in terms of money and privileges, in terms of leniency, in terms of not following through with consequences, and expecting too little from our children in terms of contribution, in terms of responsibility, in terms of accountability. So that was his first finding. And this was very interesting. This is from a different source, which says that America's newly identified at-risk group for high risk of emotional disorders, especially anxiety and depression, are preteens and teens from affluent families who are those earning $120,000 or more per year. And it suggests that 30 to 40% of 12 to 18-year-olds from affluent families are experiencing disturbing psychological symptoms. So this is again an extremely disturbing finding. The other thing about parenting practices, what the study showed was that we blur the line between parent and friend. And what this means is simply that this whole idea of, a lot of, every time, we do a workshop, most parents say that, yes, I want to be a friend to my children. And I think we need to distinguish between being approachable, being friendly, having a good relationship with them, and on the other hand, being a friend. Because our job as parents is not to be our children's friends. They have a lot of friends. What they don't have others of is parents. The job of a friend and a parent is obviously very different. As parents, we need to sometimes make extremely unpopular and hard choices, which friends seldom do. So, when I say that be a parent and not a friend, I'm not saying do not have a great relationship with your children. But what we are saying is that we cannot blur the line between friend and parent. We do need to be in charge as parents. What the study also found was that we have and we give of too much of everything except time. So the biggest difference between or the big challenge of too much of a good thing is that we do give a lot of material things, except um, you know, we are living in this age which is called the great time famine. So we simply do not we all of us continuously feel the pressure of not having enough time. And I thought this was very telling. There's a lot of anger in my generation. You can hear it in the music. Kids are angry for a lot of reasons, but they're mostly angry because parents aren't around. So the idea is that it is not, this whole idea of quality time is actually quite a myth because, parenting itself does take time. There is no such thing as efficient parenting in that um you cannot parent in a short amount of time. We know that a lot of magic of the family life happens in the small day-to-day moments which are built up over time. And it doesn't, if we think that, we will make it all up in taking our children out for a holiday to a fancy resort to make up for all the time that we do not spend together as a family, that rarely makes up for us not being around. And what our parenting practices also show is that we claim that we are very concerned about our children's happiness and emotional well-being, which again is quite different from parents of previous generations who simply this was not something on their radar screens. So, given that we are really concerned about our children's happiness and emotional well-being, but the first thing we need to obviously recognize is that giving them these things is not making them happy. And I think we talked about this last time as well, that although at some level parents understand this or they claim they understand it, and yet they feel compelled to engage in this whole cycle of consumption and of um, acquisition. So I think all of us know that basically their best bet for happiness or their biggest chance for happiness is obviously their relationship and connection to Allah. And, if we are going to spend time on anything, that would be worthwhile to spend time on is to build that relationship or to encourage or to foster that relationship, their relationship with Allah. And that is not, again, that's not something that we can shortcut. It's not something that happens overnight. Also, there's quite a bit of research on faith and social adjustment, and this is specifically on teens. And again, there is a tendency in some circles to um, to think that, or to go the other way in not really fostering that kind of thing, thinking that it's going to come from within. But what research shows is that teens who are encouraged to practice their faith have a higher levels of altruism and lower levels of theft, vandalism, violence, drug, alcohol abuse, and less likelihood of sexual activity. So obviously, there is a very positive correlation between faith, between the practice of faith, and in having a strong conscience, in not being subject to the crisis of conscience that we are talking about. Also, what will make our kids successful and happy are very key emotional and social skills. And, apart from, quite contrary to what we think, by making life easy for them, we are making them happy. It's actually quite the opposite. Being absorbed in a challenging activity, self-efficacy means the ability and the confidence to do things for yourself. Frustration tolerance and the ability to cope with stress, compassion, emotional maturity, self-control, a sense of self-worth tempered by humility, and the ability to self-regulate emotions. These are actually really key skills which result in a child growing up to be internally contented, at having a much greater life satisfaction. Um, Also, it's probably a good idea for us to actually look at our own level of materialism and how that may be contributing to this whole crisis of conscience and to this lack of purpose, the rise of depression and anxiety in children. Um, just some questions for self-reflection is, again, as Imam Ali alayhi salam taught us, it's not what we own, but what owns us that is the problem. So it's really very little to do with our standard of living, but it has everything to do with our relationship to the things that we have. So again, what is our relationship to material things? Do we see them as identity enhancers? In other words, do we feel that what we own sometimes increases our self-worth? Um, do certain possessions induce a subtle feeling of importance or superiority? For example, a friend of mine said that she had this really expensive ring that she only wore when she feels really insecure because somehow it made her feel more secure. But when she was feeling happy and at peace with who she was, she did not feel like she needed to wear it. Does the lack of things make you feel inferior to those who have them? Do you casually mention things you own or show them off to increase your sense in some ways or through them in your own? Do you feel resentful or angry and somehow diminished in your sense of self when someone has more than you? And do we have an endless striving for more? One of the saddest examples of this is Paul Getty, who was then the richest man in the world. When he was asked what it felt like to be the richest man in the world, he said, not rich enough. And that really brings to mind, again, Imam Ali's thing about the nature of the world is being like the salty sea. That is, that it does not have the capability of quenching your thirst. And the more we drink of it, obviously, the thirstier we get. Um, so again, as we talk about the whole idea of the society and how the materialism is getting to our families, it's a really good idea to reflect on our own relationship to material things and to see again, because as we say again and again, the most important relationship or the strongest influence in our children's life is actually ourselves and how we live our life rather than what we say or how others act around them. So we probably use this quote at every session, but it is a good thing to remind ourselves that not to worry that children are not hearing what we're saying. We need to really be conscious and mindful of the fact that they are seeing everything that we are doing and how we are living our lives. Um, so again, how do we curb our own materialistic tendencies? So obviously, it starts with first being honest that it is us and not the kids. And again, oftentimes, we get into this cycle or this rat race where we think that, just because our children are asking for the newest sneakers, we have to give in. Um, and sometimes giving in is the easiest way. But if we really recognize that it is us and not the kids, for whatever reason we feel the need to give them everything, whether it's guilt for not having enough time or because we think it will somehow make them, um, it will help them to get along with their friends or whatever. Limiting TV, how is that related? Because obviously we know that all TV that they watch, and even when they are online, they are actually being targeted by the consumer society through advertisements to actually want and need more things. So the same thing is with magazines. Obviously, the most magazines actually do not have that much content. What they do have is advertisements, which are, and again, it's a good idea to actually have a conversation with our children about, even if we are looking at an ad or if we are watching TV and we are being subject to marketing, if we are conscious of it and if we make our children conscious of it, they will react to it differently than if they are simply passive consumers or if they're not conscious of it. Do not use shopping as a recreational activity. Sometimes the easiest thing for us to do on the weekend with children tends to be to go and hang out at the mall. And again, the idea is that it is not, it's, if we do that, it's going to be much harder to then fight the materialism and fight everything that goes along with it if we are in that environment. So again, it's much more challenging and it takes a lot more effort and time and commitment to come up with alternatives to taking the easy way out. But obviously, in the long run, I think we recognize that that would be a lot better, not only for our children, but basically for our family as a whole. So monitor your own urges. In other words, use a 30-day shopping list. What does this mean? So every time, a lot of families do this, that they have an ongoing list, and if anybody needs anything, they will first put it on the list and look at it, let it stay on the list for a month to see at the end of it if you still want it. If you still need it or want it, they will go and buy it, but not before the 1 month is over. And the thinking behind that is obviously sometimes we think we want something or we need something on an impulse because we've seen an ad or something's come up. But if we actually give it a little bit of time, we will recognize that I don't really need it that much. So the 30-day shopping list can be a really useful strategy to keep those tendencies in check. Decluttering, how does this help? So if we make a regular habit of decluttering our environment and actually, giving away or getting rid of the things that we accumulate and are not using, it actually puts us in very strong connection um, with how much we have compared to how little we use. So when we're decluttering and we realize, what, we're not using so many things that we thought we needed, hopefully it should remind us and recognize that we don't, that we can do with a lot less. Also becoming environmentally conscious. So again, recognizing the idea that this whole cycle of conscious, conspicuous consumption is really not good for the health of the planet, in addition to the health of the family and the individual. So I'd like to end with this little story. Many of you may have heard it, and it is the story about basically the value of struggle and not making it too easy for our children in various ways. So there was a little boy who found um, who found a caterpillar, and he actually took the caterpillar and put it in a little jar and brought it home, and used to put a stick in it and used to feed the caterpillar. And soon the caterpillar started to build a cocoon around it. Now the mother realized what had happened, and she explained to the child that the the caterpillar was becoming ready to become a butterfly. When the chrysalis was almost ready to break open, and the boy saw that the butterfly was struggling to come out of it, he he found it very painful to watch the struggle. And what he did was he took a little knife and cut open the chrysalis so that it would help the butterfly come out. And what happened was that the butterfly's wings never developed to be the strong, and it wasn't able to fly properly. And the idea was, obviously, what the boy didn't realize was that it was the struggle in coming out of the chrysalis that strengthened the wings of the butterfly so that it was able um, to fly and to survive and to thrive. So that's, I think, a lot of how our parenting is, that when we see our children struggle, it's extremely difficult for us to watch the struggle, and sometimes we want to make it easy for the children, and we need to remind ourselves that what is the struggle and um, the striving is actually going to help them in the long run to become competent and useful and well adjusted adults. So it's not such a bad thing. Um, so we're today at the end of the presentation as well as the time. I will stay around for a little bit. Today we didn't have too much time for interaction or questions, but I would really love to hear your comments, or if you would like to share some thoughts about today's session, that would be great. Thank you so much.